All right, so you've got your clusters in place, your pipeline, your automation. Maybe some teams are using Terraform while other teams are experimenting with something new such as Pulumi or Crossplane. And you're now increasing the number of clusters you manage and the number of development teams deploying their applications in your clusters. So the question comes, how do you enable application support in a way that developers can support their applications, understand where errors are, and be able to act on their own without increasing toil and the load on the DevOps or platform engineering team? On this quick video, I'll show you how to build a centralized application management dashboard for your developers to support their applications in just a few seconds. Let's see it. All right, so the scenario I have here, I have two clusters created on Amazon EKS. And even though I'm going to be using two clusters from EKS, you can replicate exactly the same thing, even if you're using on GKE, AKS, or maybe one cluster on EKS and another cluster on GKE. The reason why I chose EKS is because there's no worse experience when it comes to managing applications than EKS, right? So let's see. If I go to my terminal, I have my terminal connected to, I think cluster A, for example. And if I get a namespace here, I see that I have Magento Dev and Magento Prod. So let's say I have kind of the same applications, just broke down into two different environments, and maybe different teams will have different access to the different environments, right? So I have one deployed in Dev and another one deployed in Prod. And on cluster B, I have another configuration. Right, another app, I think it's WordPress. So let's start. How do we uncover this, right? If you go back to EKS, let's be honest, giving this to your developers, it's pretty bad, right? I mean, how much can your developers really know what's going on and then support and understand everything from here? So let's go from here. I'm gonna be using Shipa Cloud. The best solution you have out there to manage applications if you're thinking about scaling. I'm going to be using the cloud version of Shipa, which you can sign up on apps.shipa.cloud. But if you are an Amazon customer and you're using primarily EKS and you want to run everything within your infrastructure, Shipa is also available in the AWS marketplace. So you can sign up for Shipa and run Shipa inside your EKS or Shipa's control plane inside your EKS clusters directly from AWS Marketplace. Check it out. But if you want to use Shipa Cloud, sign up at apps.shipa.cloud, and here's the dashboard I have. So Bruno, I'm the DevOps engineer or platform engineer, and I want to start bringing my users and my applications across multiple clusters so they can manage their applications. Great. The first step for you is to come under user management. Directly here, you can invite the developers in your organizations, as well as add the different teams you may have, such as Team 1, Project 1, or whatever way you define. You can create these teams in here. You can invite your users. Shipa supports, for example, SAML integration. So if you're using something such as Azure AD for connection or authentication, you can integrate that. And we have pre-built roles such as developers or operators, which you can assign to your teams, and you can also customize. So step one is coming into Shipa and invite your users. Step number two is then start creating the connection between Shipa and the underlying cluster, right? We do that through what we call policy frameworks. So think about it as a grouping of policies that you're going to be connecting to a cluster to surface your applications, and even later, if you want, see how the existing applications you have in your cluster, they compare to the policies that you define. So you can see application security posture, right? That is a separate topic, but let's start creating our policy framework to connect to the underlying cluster. The easiest way when you come to frameworks and click on create is to choose discover existing applications. This will give you the minimal inputs that you need to enter in order for Shipa to discover applications. If you click on next, you can enter the name of the framework. So we can replicate and call Magento Dev, for example. just to mimic what we have. And the minimum you have to assign is, for example, the plan that you want to make sure that applications deploy into Magento Dev, they comply with the resource consumption policies that you have. This is part of the policy security posture. We're going to talk more about it later. If you just created your account on Shippa, you have a Shippa plan here. You can select this one, or you can create another one later. But again, this is part of the policies. Here on Kubernetes namespace, right? Shippa, if you don't have a namespace in that cluster, Shippa, when you connect this policy framework to your cluster, it will create a namespace for you, and everything deployed through that namespace will go through these policies. But because we already have a namespace with our applications deployed, right? If we come in here, we have our Magento Dev, for example, and if we do get pods, for example, on our Magento Dev, we can see that we already have a few pods in there. So we don't want Shippa framework to create a namespace, but rather we want it to leverage that connect to that existing namespace and leverage that one. So let's just make sure that this Kubernetes namespace matches what we have, right? I'll just leave it cluster empty because I'm going to be connecting to a new cluster. Next screen is going to ask me to enter a label. And this is how Shippa is going to uncover these applications, right? Go through the discovery process and bring them here. If we go back to our terminal and I just do kubectl describe pod, let's say Magento, right? And we go up, I can see app.kubernetes.io name, for example. I will use this one because it's probably a common name across different pods that I have for Magento. If we go back to Shippa, you can enter this here, and maybe I'll say the suffix is Magento Dev. The reason is because I have the same application deployed in a different namespace. So I want to make sure that I separate them, Magento Dev and my Magento Prod. And you can do that to separate different environments, or maybe if you're hosting different customers, it's customer 1, customer 2. And every pod Shippa discovers, Shippa is going to add that suffix later here. So just click on create. Easy, right? Even I can do it. So the next step for you is connecting that framework to your EKS cluster so Shippa can start discovering these apps. If you come to clusters and you click on create, for example, you're gonna see Shippa automatically selects Magento Dev. If you created another one, Magento Prod, for example, you would see that option here as well. You can select multiple frameworks. And then Kubernetes control plane. You can get the control plane by copying the command that we make available here as a sample. And if we go back to our terminal and we run that command, we get the endpoint. I'll copy this endpoint and I'll go back to Shippa. I'll just paste that endpoint and click on generate command. The generate command creates a kubectl command for me. I run that in my cluster. What's going to happen now is Shippa will create a namespace called Shippa in your cluster, and it will install the services required for Shippa to discover the applications in that cluster, as well as connect to that namespace. The process should take between 1 and 2 minutes. So now we just wait, and I'll cut the video so you don't have to wait.
A few moments later.
All right, so the process should have finished by now. And if we go back to Shippa and we go on events, I can see the cluster connect event is done. And I actually also see some app create events here. Let's check it out. If you go to applications, for example, here now we have our Magento related application with Magento Dev at the end. And if I go into the app, I now can see the resource plan, for example, that this application should use as limit. I should see things such as the container image that this app is using, every environment variable that this application needs to run. I can see where this application is exposed. And as we start kind of moving to the right here, I can see kind of how the resources are performing over time. where the units, the unit information or the container information, if it's a multi-region cluster, you can see where this is distributed. You will see life cycle, which is awesome because from the moment you connect Shippa to your applications, Shippa will create an app create event, just like here. And now every new deployment that happens, or every time the application goes down or restarted or anything that happens, that activity along with the log will be recorded here. So you don't lose that when new deployments happen. And it's easy, if there are problems, it's easy for your developers to come in and understand what's happening, right? Or you or your SRE team to understand what happened to the application over time. You can access the logs of the application directly here. So your developers don't need to kubectl into the cluster, try to understand what's a kubectl log, for example, and get the pod and get the service directly here. They can access the log. Awesome, right? Less time developers have to spend in the cluster, the better for the DevOps and for the development teams. You can see integrations directly here as well as another thing. You can come in, create a connection into your incident management tool, be it Slack or be it Teams or whatever, Jira or whatever you use. Those are all event webhooks. And you can tie every event, for example, if your application was deleted, restarted, if there is an error with the application, you can tie that and send an event. Easy. Now anyone can start getting events related to their application. So you can see all the logs, all the metadata for your application. You can see every event that happened to your application over time, get alerts. And another point as well is you can see the dependencies that your application have, right? So here I can see my Magento app is running, but I can see all the objects that are related to my Magento app. And directly from here, I can get the status of that object as well as the details of those objects, right? Now, as a developer, if there is a problem with my application, I can quickly identify where the problem is because this will dynamically turn red, or if there's a new deployment happening, you're gonna see a new version in yellow happening. So it's very visual. So if there's a problem now, you have application metadata, application history, you have events and alerts going over your Slack. You can see exactly where the application is failing, and you can even see the network map for that application. Right now it's super busy because there are no network policies applied to this application. So basically anything can ingress and egress in and out of my application, which is not great. Awesome, much better, right? Than this thing here. Now I have my Magento dev, for example. If prod, sorry, we did our Magento dev. If you want to come in here and say, I want to add another one, I'll just say discover application. And you're gonna say Magento prod. I'll select prod plan, and I'll just make sure this matches our namespace Magento prod. And here, if you have multiple teams or different teams, right? Like maybe a team 1 can only have access to Magento dev and team 2 can have access to Magento prod. You can just customize it here. So when your developers log into the dashboard, they can see the proper applications or they can see them all. But because I already have a cluster here, I can just connect that to my cluster. Let me see which one is my AWS. This one. Oops. If I just come in here, Magento prod, I'll just select this one, make sure the namespace matches, and I'll just say, hey, I already have that cluster. I'm just connecting to a new namespace in the same cluster. I can just come in here and say this one. I'll click on next. I can add the same name, the same labels, right? Because I know it's Magento is the same label, but I'll just say here prod, so I can know the difference, right? And I'll just click on create. Now Shippa will just connect to that new namespace and we'll start slowly discovering the application in a few seconds. If you have a new cluster and you want to add, because chances are you're going to have multiple clusters either in the same cloud provider or multiple cloud providers, same process, right? With Shippa, you're going to get that centralized view and management of your application, which is awesome. It can facilitate just so much the support of your application and developer productivity and reduce the toil on the DevOps. So you can just come in here. If I just go to my cluster 2, now, for example, and I just say AWS, I'll just connect to my cluster B, I think. And I do get namespace, for example. I have a namespace called WordPress with my WordPress application deployed in that cluster. So now you want to start bringing all these applications together, right? So you can properly manage them. Same thing, going back to Shippa, I'll just say discover existing apps, and I'll say it's WordPress, and I'll select the planned prod. Again, I'll make sure this matches the namespace I have in that cluster that I want to connect. And because it's a new cluster, I won't select anything here. I'll just say next. I'll grab a label, which is probably, my guess, the same. Describe pod. Let me see. Okay, this little one here. Same thing. And if we go back to Shippa, we can just say WP EKS, for example. When you click on create, Shippa will again run all the connection to your cluster. Oh, sorry, I have to connect it to my cluster. Sorry, I'll come in here and say WordPress. I'll copy this and I'll run this command here to get my Kubernetes endpoint, which I just did. And I go back to Shippa, I just paste it there, generate the command I need, and I run that command here. Shippa will do the same process. We'll connect to my EKS cluster B, for example, create the Shippa namespace and run everything that I need, and connect to that existing namespace and start discovering my applications in that namespace using my label. If I go back to Shippa and I go into events, you can see the process that is running for that event directly here and the status. Cluster create, for example, and you're gonna see all the information here. If we go back to our applications, you can see now my Magento prod is also here, right? And you can see, well, I have some problems with some applications in here, and you can keep on seeing everything that you need. Now it's easy to identify and spot which applications have problems and then go dig deep from there. I hope that was helpful.